Has the Federal Reserve successfully engineered a soft landing? Or are geopolitical conflicts, the upcoming presidential election, rising consumer debt, and high interest rates setting the stage for an economic downturn in 2024? This presentation offers an in-depth analysis of key factors shaping economic outcomes, including interest rates, global conflicts, wage dynamics, business confidence, and demographics. Anirban Basu will then provide a forecast for the coming year, highlighting major risks that economic stakeholders will likely encounter. Please welcome Anirban Basu.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you very much. I want to thank whoever created that video. Completely unnecessary, but nonetheless, privileged to be with you today. I'm going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. In fact, that'll be a moderated Q&A session. Though, of course, one of my goals is to try to address some of your questions regarding the global macroeconomy as I go through this presentation. I'm going to use U.S. economic data a lot today, but that doesn't mean we cannot discuss the global economy, and I will sprinkle in some discussion of the global economy as I go through the material. My presentation today is entitled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is a Clint Eastwood themed presentation. You'll see that theming throughout the presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it, but it's firmly baked in the cake, and today I will share with you some good, some bad, and some ugly, but I want to start with the good. And at least from an American perspective, there has been a ton of good economically. And this has been unanticipated. There was a conventional wisdom coming into last year, coming into 2023, that recession was inevitable in America. Indeed, the economists at Bloomberg, that source of phenomenal business intelligence, maintain a forecasting index. And as of October of 2022, that index was suggesting that the probability of America falling into recession was 100%. And you may be aware that that is the highest possible probability, that you cannot actually get above 100% unless you're talking about the Baltimore Ravens defense, which, as you've heard, gives 110%. But otherwise, 100% is the most you can get. 2022 was a terrible year for the U.S. equity markets. It was also the year, of course, that interest rates took off. And these were thought to be precursors to an economic downturn in 2023. Did not occur. Last year, the U.S. economy grows 2.5%. These are quarterly data, annualized rates of GDP growth for the United States of America. We have data now for the first 2 quarters of 2024. So last year, as I said, the U.S. economy grows 2.5% during the first quarter of 2024. And much of the data I'll show you today are time series data, so the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. But during that first quarter, the U.S. economy grows 1.4% on an annualized basis. A bit soft, but often first quarters come in soft statistically. Just got the second quarter data in last week, 2.8% growth on an annualized basis. So for the first half of the year, the U.S. economy continues to grow at trend. The Atlanta Federal Reserve maintains a product known as GDP Now, which estimates current quarter gross domestic product. And we, of course, neatly ensconced now in this third quarter. And that product suggests that the U.S. economy is on pace to once again grow around 2.8% this quarter. None of these data are indicia of recession, indeed indication of a U.S. economy that continues to manifest lots of progress. Now, the outlook for the rest of the world has not been quite as good in general. So the International Monetary Fund projects that the U.S. economy this year will grow 2.6%, but that Germany, Italy, France will all grow less than 1% this year. Europe, in fact, will grow less than 1% this year. The Japanese economy expected to grow a bit more than 0%. The leader in terms of growth among the major European economies, the Spanish economy expected to grow 2.4% this year. Obviously, their secret to growth is squirting tourists with water. But for the most part, the U.S. economy has outperformed most advanced societies, and that momentum continues. And of course, with respect to the U.S. economy, there have been certain segments of the economy that have outperformed others, and at the heart of that statement is the American consumer. This is monthly retail sales. Just got the data in for June. If you look on a monthly basis, just look month by month by month toward the right of the slide, you don't see much growth there on a monthly basis. But if you were to compare retail sales today against where we were pre-pandemic, when the US economy was deemed to be quite strong, the American consumer continues to be on a spending tear. And as it turns out, much of the growth in consumer outlays recently in the United States have not been, or has not been, on retailed items here depicted, but on services, things like travel. So during a recent Sunday, the Americans set a record for the number of people passing through TSA checkpoints. They're spending on Beyonce concert tickets. They're spending on Taylor Swift concert tickets. In August of 2023, the average Taylor Swift concert ticket sold, purchased on resale, that's how people buy them on resale, for $1,619 per ticket. And she sold out major football stadiums multiple times in cities around the country. She just toured Australia. Australia expected to grow 1.4% this year, according to the International Monetary Fund. The Australian government thanked her for generating about $300 million in economic impact. Taylor Swift is not simply a musical phenomenon, she's an economic one. And I would say to you as an aside that this thing between her and Travis Kelce is the greatest thing that could have ever occurred. This is fabulous, it's fantastic, it's precisely what this nation needed during these challenging economic times, not at all annoying. And what you have here is this hunky athlete, this handsome tight end from the Kansas City Chiefs, three-time Super Bowl winning Travis Kelce, in a relationship with the lovely, savvy singer-songwriter Taylor Swift. Nice relationship. There are pictures of them kissing on the internet. Now, some of that's artificially generated, but the point is that these pictures have many people aglow, abuzz, and hopeful, and there is reason for hope. Because unlike many stories, this one stands to end well because they're such a handsome couple. They're going to produce at the end of the day one very beautiful #1 hit song, because when that breakup occurs, and it will occur, the music is going to flow, and I, for one, cannot wait. Now, I'm going to make the case that the American consumer is 7% of the US economy. And the US economy is about 1/4 of the global economy. That the US consumer cannot continue to spend in this fashion. And at the heart of that statement is American demography. These are Federal Reserve Bank data. I'm just breaking down US wealth by household, not income, wealth. So by percentile, just stacking the wealthiest households in America down through the least wealthy households. So the teal-colored slice at the top of the slide, that's the wealth controlled by the top 0.1% of Americans. So that's your David Rubenstein, who just bought the Baltimore Orioles, or Matt Ishbia, who owns the Phoenix Suns, or many, many others. That top 0.1% controls about 13.6% of the nation's wealth. America, of course, is a phenomenally wealthy nation. And that top 0.1% controls 13.6% of the nation's wealth. You look at the green segment there down below, that's the balance of the top 1%. So that's your 99th percentile to your 99.9th percentile, another 16.8% of the nation's wealth. So the top 1% controls a bit more than 30% of the nation's wealth. If you look at the yellow slice below that, that's the wealth controlled by the balance of the top 10%. So that's the 90th percentile to the 99th percentile. They control another 36.6%, which means that the top 10% controls almost precisely 2/3 of the nation's wealth. Not making a political statement about that, simply pointing out where the wealth exists. If you look at the brown stripe below that brown stripe below that, that's the wealth controlled by the 50th to the 90th percentile. So that's 40% of the population controlling about 30.5% of the nation's wealth, which means that the bottom 50% of Americans control 2.5% of the nation's wealth. So these are by and large people who live on fixed incomes. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They do not have much financial wealth upon which to lean. And to the extent that they have wealth is because some of these folks are homeowners and they have some equity in their homes. But they don't have a lot of liquid financial wealth. So they live paycheck to paycheck. Here's the great news. Lots of paychecks in America. Just got the JOLTS, data from the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. Data just came out for June. In June, America home to 8.2 million available unfilled jobs. You might notice that the number of job openings has been falling in general, not the last couple of months, but in general, but still quite high relative to the pre-pandemic level. Again, pre-pandemic, the economy was deemed to be quite strong. America had a 3.5% rate of unemployment. At that point, it was a 50-year low. We had about 7 million available unfilled jobs back then. Now we have 8.2 million. I will point out, however, in the June data, that the number of job openings in construction plummeted. And we'll talk about the role of interest rates and construction starts later on in the presentation. But Economy-wide, the U.S. economy continues to perform quite well, and when you enter each and every month with lots of available unfilled jobs, it is quite likely that that month the nation will add jobs on net, which is exactly what we've seen since December of 2020, the last time America lost jobs on a monthly basis. So whether it's been hurricanes or bridge collapses or wildfires, month by month by month, the U.S. economy has managed to add jobs. And in June, America adds another 206,000 jobs. Now, these data come from the Establishment Survey, the survey of employers. There's a separate survey, the Household Survey, that produces the unemployment rate estimates. And unemployment, according to that survey, is on the rise, now to 4.1%, but still not particularly high. And I would say to you that in many cases, it is still an employee's market as opposed to an employer's market. For instance, in 2023, we saw that labor flexed its musculature. So we had strikes among actors and writers, for instance. One of the reasons we did not have an early summer blockbuster. So last year we had Barbie and Oppenheimer. It's only been the last few days we have a summer blockbuster now. It's almost August. And part of that was because we generated less content during those strikes. We had strikes among UAW members, meaning United Auto Workers members. Now, some negotiations did not end in strikes. Let me give you an example. The negotiations between UPS, United Parcel Service, and the Teamsters Union, that produced a 5-year agreement. And during the 5th year of that agreement, the average full-time UPS truck driver will be earning $170,000 per annum. That's $170K. Now, that's wages plus benefits, but it's $170K, forcing people like myself to ask the question, how do I look in brown? And based on the app, spectacular. I mean, but the point is, that's great for consumption. And much of the growth we've seen in percentage terms, in terms of compensation gains, has been at the most entry level of occupations, people who work in restaurants, hotels, retailers, so on and so forth. And all of that helps to fuel this consumption boom that we've seen, and therefore broader economic growth. And of course, that growth has been faster in certain parts of the country than in others. So this is the percentage employment change in America's 25 largest metropolitan areas between February of 2020, why that month? That is the last month before the US economy is shut down. So the public health emergency is declared on March 13th of 2020. So I'm using February of 2020 as the pre-pandemic baseline of employment, comparing employment that month in these various communities to June 2024 employment levels. The left-hand column is populated by the regions adding the most jobs over this not quite 4.5-year period, and you'll notice it's basically the American South. There's a neat correspondence between population growth and job growth. In recent years, no region of the country has added more people in absolute terms than the Dallas metropolitan area. So it's Dallas #1, followed by Charlotte, San Antonio, Tampa, Orlando, Houston, Phoenix, Riverside, California, which has benefited economically from migration from Los Angeles to the east of Los Angeles, because during this period, many Americans have been looking for more affordable, less densely populated markets. So they've moved from very expensive, more densely populated LA to somewhat less expensive Riverside, California, Denver to the west, Miami to the south. Philadelphia, as it turns out, makes into that left-hand column. You might ask the question, why? Well, again, Americans have been looking for less populated, less densely populated markets. Now, Philadelphia is dense and expensive, don't get me wrong, but not compared to New York. And so we've seen that migration down I-95, including into the Philadelphia suburbs, which, generally speaking, are quite nice places in which to live, to raise a family, et cetera. And again, more affordable than the 5 boroughs of New York City, for instance, is a general proposition. We see that migration continuing. Those of you football fans here know that Saquon Barkley moving from New York to Philadelphia. For the most part, the Northeast Corridor is in the right-hand column, New York Metro, Washington, Boston, my town of Baltimore toward the bottom, and then 3 West Coast markets at the very bottom, Portland, Los Angeles, San Francisco, various issues there, including, again, the elevated cost of living. Now, I find this slide to be quite interesting, but the next slide is far more important macroeconomically. Same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of percentage job growth, these are rates of unemployment. And they are through June, the last month for which we have data. And as a general proposition, these unemployment rates are low. It's still a quite tight labor market. 8.2 million available unfilled jobs in America is quite high by historic standards, but you will note some evidence of slowing. That if you look at the right-hand column, particularly the bottom of the right-hand column, so here we are in San Diego, the unemployment rate here is 4.5%. not particularly high, but in other parts of Southern California, you're looking at unemployment rates now above 5%, and in Chicagoland, over 6%. So again, the labor market is softening. We'll talk more about this later in the presentation. Still, from a GDP perspective, America continues to grow a trend, and we continue to see some pressures on wages, and we see that also, as it turns out, in the construction marketplace. So that's what brings me to this slide. This gets at the construction wage premium. So historically, for various reasons, because construction workers have to have specialized skills, they work outdoors, often have to work very early morning hours, those kinds of things, typically the construction worker has made more than their private sector counterparts, at least in non-supervisory, non-management categories. So if you look at this black line that runs through the middle here, that's the construction wage premium average for the 20 years prior to the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, for 20 years, the average construction worker made 21.7% more than their private sector counterpart. Now, the green line is the actual wage premium at any given time. And what you see here is that by June of 2024, this wage premium is down to 18.6%. Why? It means that wages have climbed more rapidly in other occupational categories. And again, we have seen some profound increase in compensation among fulfillment center workers, workers in the energy patch, retail workers, so on and so forth. And so all of a sudden, construction is not offering the wage premium that it historically has, which implies that construction is going to have to pay more for workers to continue to compete against other segments of the economy. And that brings me to the UPS truck driver. So I do not begrudge the UPS driver that level of compensation. These are very special people. They have to be able to drive a large vehicle, park it, lift heavy objects as much as 70 pounds, sometimes more, and they have to do that over the course of a day, and pass the drug test. Most Americans cannot do all of those things, but many construction workers can. Many construction workers can drive a large vehicle, park it, lift heavy objects, and pass a drug test. So there is this competition not just between contractors for talent, but also between industries. And what that means is that, if anything, construction wages continue on average to rise higher, even in this high interest rate environment. And that is inflationary. We got data this morning on the employment cost index, one of the Federal Reserve's favorite measures of wage pressure. So wages during the second quarter rose about 0.9%, a bit below expectations of 1%, and slower than the first quarter's performance of 1.2%. But year over year, wages are still up about 4%. That's inflationary. And that brings me to the next part of my story. Given these ongoing inflationary pressures, and actually some emerging supply chain issues as well, whether with respect to the Red Sea, Panama Canal water levels, Middle East generally speaking, South China Sea, whatever it happens to be, the question becomes, is this recovery sustainable? And that brings us to the bad, the pressure points on the US economy. Will this ongoing momentum be compromised by some of the factors we'll talk about right now? And again, at the heart of that question is the American consumer. You cannot have an economic downturn unless the consumer participates. There's 7% of aggregate demand. So that brings me to this slide. This is personal savings, measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. These data come from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. If you look at the green line down below there, that's the personal savings, again measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, and you see that smooth trajectory as we move toward the pandemic, but then the pandemic changes everything. Because during the pandemic, many Americans, not all, but many received stimulus payments. Many Americans experienced meaningful wage increases during the pandemic and early stages of recovery, so their incomes actually went up, and we thank them, of course, for working through the pandemic, whether at pharmacies or medical centers or construction job sites. But even as their income went up, their spending went down, because they weren't they weren't going to concerts, they weren't seeing Beyonce or Taylor Swift or even SZA or Ice Spice, they weren't taking vacations, they weren't going to plays or movie theaters. So according to the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank economists, at the pinnacle, they had amassed about $2.1 trillion in excess savings, being savings above and beyond what they would have saved but for the pandemic. According to those same economists, by the end of last year, almost all of those savings had been spent. Which means now you have an American consumer who has spent down their pandemic-era savings. I'm not talking about every consumer, of course. I'm not talking about the top 0.1% of Americans. I think they'll be fine. I think Jeff Bezos will be fine. I think he's going to make it. I spend very little of my time as an economist worrying about Jeff Bezos, basically none, even less about Tom Brady. But it's that group of Americans who don't have much financial wealth, that's the group I worry about. And you've heard the stories at Family Dollar and Dollar General, even at Starbucks. Starbucks telling us that their occasional customers disappeared. Those folks who, during the pandemic or early stage of recovery they're would come into the Starbucks store and buy a $5 iced vanilla latte, no foam, whatever it happened to be, soy milk, and grande. So, but they're no longer there. The CEO of the retailer Five Below just up and quit, because that group of consumers is struggling now, because not only have they spent through their pandemic-era savings, but they continue to face high and rising prices. Consumer Price Index data, inflation. The dashed green-colored line is your overall rate of inflation. And what this says is that between June of 2023 and June of 2024, overall inflation running at around 3%. And you say, Anirban, that's partial victory. Because back in June of 2022, inflation is running at 9.1% year over year. Even as late 2022, inflation is around 5% year over year. We're now down to 3%. And if you do a simple extrapolation, you've gone from 9% inflation to 3% inflation, 2%, which of course the Federal Reserve's target for inflation must be right around the corner. Parenthetically, if you strip out food and energy prices, you get this dark blue-colored line, the so-called core rate of inflation at 3.3%, but it's falling. We seem to be edging towards that 2% rate of inflation. Fantastic. It would appear that the Federal Reserve has managed to engineer that soft landing after all. But still, you feel that the consumer, or at least some consumers, are starting to struggle more and more with these high and rising prices and the fact that they have spent through their pandemic-era savings. If you break down the inflation numbers, this is what you get. This is June of 2023 versus June of 2024. Again, Consumer Price Index data, the headline numbers are down below. 3% overall inflation, 3.3% on the so-called core. But the green color bar show you what's been happening categorically. Transportation services up 9.4%. Why? Well, of course. If you're going to pay the UPS truck driver that much money, of course it's going to cost more to receive services from them, directly or indirectly. Shelter costs, that's a big one. That includes things like your apartment rents or growth therein. That's about a third of the consumer price index, up 5.2%. Housing costs, of course, have risen. And the effect of this inflation is cumulative. It's accretive. This surge of inflation really shows up during the first parts of 2021. So if I were to take you back, even before then, let's say back to May of 2020, why that month? That's the first month of the economic recovery. So America loses 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. We start to add back jobs in May of 2020. And according to the National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Data Committee, the recession officially ended in April of 2020. So if you look at price levels as they were, according to the Consumer Price Index in May of 2020, and compare those to price levels in June of 2024, so roughly a 4-year comparison here, headline numbers down below, overall inflation up nearly 23% in 4 years in a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum. Strip out food and energy prices, still lofty 20%. Energy prices up 57%. Shelter costs up 23%. Food up 23%. And that's what has a lot of Americans upset, by the way, their grocery costs. So one of the things I do, I'll be doing it after this presentation, actually. I'll be taking a Lyft to the airport. There's Uber and Lyft, of course, are the choice. I tend to take Lyft because I want them to survive to compete with Uber. But, and you may know, those of you who take Ubers and Lyfts, that as a passenger, you rate the driver, you may be less aware that the driver rates you as a passenger. And I have become privy to my passenger ratings, and they're extremely low, shockingly low. And you might say, well, that makes sense, Anirban. We've been watching you speak for 22 minutes. I think this is beyond my personality. That anytime I get into an Uber or Lyft, I take that as an opportunity to interview an American. And I'll ask them questions like, hey, how much do you really make doing this on an hourly basis once you factor in depreciation and insurance costs? What's your highest level of educational attainment? What other options did you have? Does your family approve? Do you have a girlfriend? Why would you choose this vehicle in particular? And apparently these questions are off-putting. But when you ask people about the economy, this is what they'll tell you. A lot of people in Washington, D.C. are surprised by this. They say, my goodness, how can you not be happy about the economy? 4.1% rate of unemployment. Dow Jones is at 41,000 today. S&P is about 5,500. Record stock markets. Fabulous corporate earnings. Lots of consumer spending on all kinds of things, goods and services. What's not to be happy about right here? More Americans are saying we're having a tough time keeping up. Keep working, just can't keep up. We're falling behind, but we want to keep up. Because once you establish this as your standard of living, what you consume on an ongoing basis, you don't want to go back down here. But the pandemic era savings are gone, and the prices keep rising. So what do? Well, of course, you turn to the credit card. This is U.S. credit card debt, as measured by the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and it is spiking in America. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that this means that recession is coming, not at all. What I'm suggesting to you is the consumer cannot continue to spend in this fashion. And by the way, more Americans are having a tough time meeting their basic financial obligations. They're becoming delinquent on some of this debt. So this is the percentage of balances 30-plus days delinquent by loan type. You see the green line there is credit card. It's rising. Now, you might say, and many economists would say, this Basu, he's making too big a deal out of this. Because, yeah, delinquency is rising in that category, but off a very low level. This slide happens to go back to 2003. There have been other moments in economic history when credit card delinquency was higher than this, even during non-recessionary periods. So it's rising, but nothing to be too worried about. I view that as the optimistic perspective on these things. But I am no optimist. I am among the most pessimistic people you'll ever encounter. Didn't really have a girlfriend in high school, did not have one in college. I'm from Baltimore. So I expect bad things to happen all the time. And I look at this, I think the trend is ominous and not in isolation. The yellow line there is auto loan delinquency. It's rising. At the very bottom, mortgage, that's in brown. Now, mortgage delinquency, again, is rising off an absurdly low level, fair enough, but it's rising. And if people are missing their mortgage payments now, that tells you that some fraction of Americans, in fact, moving up the socioeconomic ladder, are having greater financial difficulty. The only category in which you do not see a structural increase in delinquency is HELOCs, that's your home equity lines of credit. What do we know about people with HELOCs? They own a home, of course, they have a mortgage, but they also have equity in that home. So that gives you a different slice of American demography. Nonetheless, none of this is particularly good. And not to tell you, this behavior has surprised me. And why is that? I've been surprised by the willingness of the American consumer to take on so much debt. Because I was taught in school that the most important price in the economy is the interest rate. This is the commercial bank interest rate on credit card plans. And of course, it's spiked over the last couple of years as the Federal Reserve has maintained tighter monetary policy. We'll talk more about them in just a moment. So what was I thinking naively? That faced with these higher borrowing costs, the American consumer would take on less credit card debt, or less debt less rapidly than they have. They spent right through it. There's a phenomenon called buy now, pay later. So there are firms out there like a firm, I'd not to pick on them, but they're the most successful of their breed. They don't report to credit rating agencies. So you might finance a jewelry purchase, something like that with a firm, that kind of thing. Buy now, I find, is quite easy. That's not challenging. It's the pay later part that's challenging. And there's a lot of pay later built into the US economy, which again suggests that the consumer cannot continue to spend in this fashion, though they're going to try. And one of the games that Americans play is this: look, I've maxed out this credit card, I've missed some payments, I'm paying some penalties and interest, no problem, I'll just get another credit card. And I'll move the balances from this credit card, this existing one, to the new one with that low introductory rate, and I can do this forever, but they can't. This is net percentage of domestic banks tightening standards for credit card loans. Credit conditions are tightening in America. So this is the percentage of banks saying, more likely to say no to a credit card application, minus those who are more likely to say yes. The number is well above 0%, which means that more banks are tightening credit standards for credit card issuance than loosening them. And you see this across the board: commercial institutional loans, commercial real estate loans, loans for multifamily development. Credit conditions are tightening out there. And of course, we understand why that is. A group of policymakers in Washington, D.C. want to tighten credit conditions. They have a dual mandate, and one of their mandates is price stability, and their measure of price stability is 2% inflation, and we're not there yet. So this is their principal mechanism for trying to influence economic growth, and it's byproduct of inflation. This is the federal funds rate, the overnight bank lending rate. In some countries like Australia, it's called the cash rate. But this is the rate at which banks can borrow from one another overnight. And why would a bank do that? Because banks need a certain amount of reserves inside the bank to make loans outside of it, and occasionally banks run up against that constraint. When this rate is set at a low level, banks are more likely to borrow from one another, thereby shoring up their reserves, thereby lending more aggressively in the economy. When the rate is set at a high level, banks are less likely to engage in such behavior. Now, this, again, burst of inflation shows up during the first part of 2021. The Federal Reserve does absolutely nothing about it at that time. They think that inflation is transitory, a word that now every American knows. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. They think it's purely supply chain driven, that as supply chains normalize, as employees are rehired, supply will rise up to meet that rage in demand, and inflation will just naturally abate to that 2% level we'd enjoyed for many years as Americans pre-pandemic. Instead, what the Federal Reserve appears to have done is presided over the creation of a wage price spiral. So prices take off in 2021. Employees notice, boss, I need a raise. Boss says, no problem, I'll give you a raise. I need you. There's lots of unmet demand out there. My customers are yelling at me. They want me to accelerate my delivery, accelerate construction delivery, whatever it happens to be. So here's your raise. I'll just pass along my cost increases to my customers. Wage price spiral. And we continue to live with that to a certain extent. Now, after about a year of this, pretending that it was transitory, they start to push back. March 17th, they start raising interest rates. But even then, they only dip their toes in inflation-fighting waters. On March 17th of 2022, they raised rates a quarter point. Next meeting was 0.5%. Next 4 meetings consecutively, 0.75% each meeting, then back to 0.5%, then 0.25%, 0.25%. May 3rd of last year, 0.25%, pause in June. July 26th, 0.25%, pause last 7 meetings. And they'll pause again this week, as it turns out. So I'll make 8. And that's that flat segment that you see at the top of the slide there. But that means that an interest rate that had been 0.25%, the upper limit of the Fed funds rate, is now 5.5%. Now, coming into the year, the conventional wisdom was the Federal Reserve would cut rates 6 or 7 times. How many rate cuts so far? 0. Because the inflation data early in the year was sticky, stubbornly high. More benign over the last 3 months or so. And the bond market has priced in a 100% chance that there will be a rate cut in September. So we can anticipate that, and my guess is there'll be another one in December, post-election. But it means that we still live with these higher interest rates. We've been living with them higher for longer. Construction starts are down in America, and why is that? Because I think theory is starting to play out. I'm going to make the case that this economy is about to weaken. And I make that case largely on theoretical grounds. Oh, I can spot some weakness in certain retail segments. I'm going to talk about the hires rate later on in the presentation. There are some indications of economic slowing. But GDP last quarter grew 2.8%. This quarter expected to grow 2.8%. So maybe some slowing, but not phenomenal amount of slowing. Again, trend growth rates. I won't go through all of this, but I want to point out this first quote here from Basu, the highly respected, highly regarded president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve, who says, quote, a large body of research tells us it can take 18 months to 2 years or more for tighter monetary policy to materially affect inflation. You say, Anirban, sheer nonsense. You might say he's highly respected, and he is, but that's pure nonsense because you yourself just said the Federal Reserve has been raising rates since March of 2022, and that over an overlapping period, inflation went from 9% to 3%. And by some measures, the core PCE deflator, core personal consumption expenditures deflator, less than 3%, 2.6%. Clearly, tighter monetary policy has had a material effect on inflation. Here's my view. And to the extent that you disagree with my thesis, your outlook for the economy will disagree with mine or differ from mine, and that's perfectly fine. I think the reason the economy has performed the way it has over the past 2+ years in the US is because supply chains have improved. They're not perfect, I get that, I just said that. You understand that. But they were more dependable than they were in late 2021. And here's what happens when supply chains improve in the context of unmet demand. Let's take new cars as an example. For a while, the Americans were having a tough time finding new cars on dealership lots, so what did? They bought used cars. What happened to the prices of used cars? Skyrocketed. But then new cars began to show up on dealership lots. All of a sudden, Americans had optionality. All of a sudden, used car prices were not rising. In fact, they've fallen 10% over the past year. You might have noticed that on a previous slide. But moreover, there was waiting, frenzied demand for those new cars. So as they hit the dealership lots, they flew off the lots. So what do you get as supply chains improve in the context of unmet demand? You get tons of transactional volume. As that supply meets that waiting demand, that's economic growth, and you get less inflation because there's more optionality, meaning less scarcity in the economy. The US economy has been associated with those things, less inflation, rapid economic growth, at least relative to the balance of the advanced world. But this suggests that the impact of these higher interest rates will affect the economy eventually. The great godfather of monetary theory, Milton Friedman, along with the great godmother, Anna Schwartz, pointed out what? That monetary policy operates with long and variable lags. The key word there is variable. You just don't know when interest rates are going to start to wallop the economy, but they will eventually. And these higher interest rates, I think, are starting to press down on the US economy more forcefully. Now, I'm not saying to anyone in the room that the interest rate increases have had no effect on the economy. Let's look at the housing market, for instance. So 2 more interest rates of interest, 30 fixed mortgage rate in blue, 15 fixed mortgage rate in green. These data come from Freddie Mac, and according to Freddie Mac, during the last week for which you have data, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate is sitting at 6.78%. You might say, Anirban, 6.78%, you're not going to make a big deal, are you, out of a 30-year fixed mortgage rate at 6.78%? Because I remember when mortgage rates were 18%. I remember when they were 15%, fair enough. But to millennials and Generation Z, these rates are preposterously high. And that's who's really subtracted themselves from the home purchasing marketplace. It's been that would-be first-time buyer, frustrated by a lack of inventory, high prices, and by their standards, extremely high borrowing costs. Now, as I move toward the tail end of this presentation, I'm going to show you a number of leading economic indicators because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been happening to a discussion of what's likely to happen going forward. Here's a leading indicator. It's mortgage applications. In fact, it's the U.S. mortgage loan applications composite index. And what it says is that mortgage applications are down about 78% from their 2021 peak. Why is this a leading indicator? Because often the journey to the settlement table begins with a mortgage application. That's the indication that somebody out there wants to transact. So what this says is the population of ready, waiting buyers has plummeted. So Anirban, housing market was in terrible shape given that demand to purchase homes has dried up so phenomenally. But by many measures, of course, the U.S. housing market is in perfectly fine shape. Look at, for instance, U.S. home sales prices as measured by the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index. Home sales prices in America are at record highs. By the way, giving me some credibility with respect to the statement that these higher interest rates have not had much effect on inflation. Because the one thing you would expect that higher interest rates would do is to calm down the housing market, at least in terms of sales prices, hasn't happened. This increase in home sales prices during the pandemic, early stage recovery, that's a 45% increase in U.S. home sales prices. And of course, during the pandemic, our behavior changed. We wanted more house, spending more time at home. We wanted more square footage. Wanted room for home office and home gyms. Wanted one room just for the Peloton. Anytime you see a Peloton advertisement, the only piece of furniture in that room is the Peloton. That's how we Americans choose to live. You buy a Peloton, you put it in a room, you lock the door. And that's how you live. And you show it to people, of course, when they visit. So, phenomenal. And then, you can see for a few months their home sales prices were falling, but not very long. Why did that happen? Yeah, we have fewer buyers, but we also, of course, fewer sellers. So if you're sitting in Duluth, Minnesota, or Bakersfield, California, or Kenosha, Illinois, with a 2.75% 30-year fix, where are you going? You're not going anywhere. You're going to be carted out of that house. You're going to leave that house in an ambulance. And so not many buyers, not many sellers, high equilibrium prices. Now, of course, this affects construction activity as well. Another leading indicator, this is U.S. building permits, residential. The orange line here is your single-family building permits. And single-family building permits don't look so bad. Why is that? Because so few existing homes are for sale that single-family builders have spied opportunities to meet unmet demand, including among those millennials. The oldest of that group is now 44 years old. That's our largest generation now of household formation, home purchasing years. The green line here, that's where you see the loss of momentum, multifamily. That relates to apartment construction. So Anirban, how is that possible? The millennials have had a hard time finding a home to buy, low inventory, high prices, high interest rates by their standards. They can't live with their parents forever, can they? They can try, but they shouldn't. So they're going to be leasing apartments. I would think lease activity would be quite strong under such circumstances. Oh, lease activity is quite strong. I mean, you can overbuild a market like in Austin, Texas, so on and so forth. The rents have been falling recently, but by and large, leasing activity is quite strong. Well, then why are multifamily building permits falling on anyone? Because increasingly, developers are having a hard time lining up project financing. And if they can line up project financing, the interest rate they're being offered is so high, their pro forma no longer pencils out. And even on a pro forma, you can only raise your rent so high. And Americans have been hit with the peak of affordability. I mean, they cannot afford any more in terms of rents than they're already paying in many cases. And so projects not moving forward. And of course, this dynamic extends well beyond the multifamily category to encompass certain segments of commercial real estate. So this is an even broader indicator, leading indicator. This is the Architecture Billings Index. You see the 50-yard line running west-east across that slide. Any reading less than 50 means that architects were less busy this month than they were last month. Count it up, 11 straight months less than 50. Architects getting less busy. Why? Because the developers for whom they work, in many cases, can't line up their project financing. And if architects are not busy upstream, contractors stand to be less busy downstream. And that brings you to a broader discussion of the U.S. non-residential construction industry. I use this movie as a segue, Bridges of Madison County. This is a 1995 movie. This is Clint Eastwood's Lover. So for much of his acting career, he spent his time shooting up the good people of San Francisco and also some folks in the Wild Wild West. This is him with Meryl Streep. And this is a movie that not only does he act in, but also he directs and produces. The gentleman has more than 40 directorial credits to his career and also is one of America's leading movie composers, composing the scores of movies like $1 Million Baby and Mystic River. So let me talk about non-residential construction here. This is it, non-residential construction. Now we can look at this any way you want to. So if you look at that green line, you look at non-residential construction spending, you say, Anirban. No wonder contractors have been so busy. Look at this phenomenal growth since the pandemic. That's 37% growth since February of 2020 in non-residential construction spending. You say, wow, that's amazing. But that figure is not just for inflation. If you adjust for inflation, you get the darker blue-colored line down below, and the increase since February of 2020 in non-residential construction spending has been 13.4%. That's not bad in a roughly 4-year period. That's not terrible, but it's just not as magical as when you look at the overall spending figure. So what does that mean? That it's not necessarily the case that users of construction services are buying a lot more construction services, but they're paying a ton more for the services that they are buying. An inflation rate of roughly 23% in about 4 years. So I can break this down by category for you. This slide does not adjust for inflation. So there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All are listed here. And these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in spending between February of 2020 and May of 2024. The headline number at the very top there, that 37% aforementioned figure. So a bit more than 4 years, 37% spending growth. That's pretty impressive, but again, not inflation adjusted. If you look at these categories, the leading source of growth has been by far manufacturing. Supply chains coming back to America. $250 billion of computer chip manufacturing plants are delivered in this country. A lot of that has to do with federal subsidization, of course. More than $100 billion in electric vehicle and battery manufacturing plants are in development in this country, close to $150 billion, last I checked. So supply chain coming back home. This is the era of the mega project. So in certain places like Columbus, Ohio, where Intel is investing, or Syracuse, New York, where it's Micron, or in Texas, where it's Samsung and Texas Instruments and Global Wafers and so on and so forth, or Arizona, Intel, et cetera, TSMC, you get these mega projects, really soaking up the capacity of the construction industry to provide services. And of course, typically driving up costs of labor and other inputs to construction. Manufacturing, and this is a secular phenomenon. This will be happening for many, many years. This is not simply a cyclical phenomenon. Also, we had an infrastructure package signed by the President November 15th of 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So you see some of these public categories, sewage and waste disposal, which is about 95% publicly financed, water supply, highway and street, all among the leaders. At the bottom, lodging. We built a ton of hotel rooms in this country during the 5 years prior to the pandemic. If you add in 24% roughly for inflation, that number gets even worse in real terms. And then the office market. Let me talk about that office market very briefly before I conclude. That's the ugly. I mean, again, last year the U.S. economy grows 2.5%. The U.S. economy continues to grow in 2024, and yet, based on CoStar data, the office vacancy rate continues to rise. Obviously, office space renewals push that rate higher. This remote work phenomenon is not going away. Why should it? A lot of people prefer working remotely, especially younger workers for a reason, very antisocial people. They don't want to see their colleagues. They don't like their colleagues. They certainly don't like their bosses. And one of the other issues here is not only do you have rising vacancy in much, not everywhere, by the way. There's some office markets that are in fine shape. I delivered a presentation recently in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because that's how glamorous my life is. And I was speaking to a group of commercial real estate developers, and they said, look, we're trying to build more Class A office space in central Pennsylvania because we haven't built much in the last few decades. And we've got major medical systems like Geisinger and others who want such space, and so that's fair enough. But certain markets are really in quite bad shape. We'll talk about those in just a moment. And so you've got many office space or office building owners in these markets not only facing falling rent rolls, but also have to refinance their mortgage in the next few years. So this is commercial real estate debt maturities, $2.5 trillion have to be refinanced over a 5-year period beginning with last year. The big years of refinancing are in front of us. Who's going to refinance that debt? I mean, not quite 18 months ago, the failures of Silicon Valley Bank, March 10th of last year, Signature Bank. Regulators are more aggressive regulating banks. Banks are more cautious in terms of lending, and real estate is viewed as risky. And you can understand why. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal about 2 months ago featuring downtown St. Louis, beautiful American historic city. The tallest building in downtown St. Louis is the 44-story AT&T building. In 2006, that building sold for $205 million. It just sold for $3.5 million. Somebody's going to take that loss. Somebody has been. And if that's somebody's bank collateral, that's problematic. In my city, the same thing, Baltimore. 1 South Street, beautiful building, 1 block from our waterfront, $66 million sale in October of 2015, sold last summer for $24 million. So somebody's going to take that loss. Similar things happening in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, other office markets. Indeed, it's really quite bad in certain markets. So you look at these downtown office vacancy rates. San Francisco, 37% as the first quarter of 2024. Denver, Colorado, strong market, but you can still build too much in a strong market, 32%. Dallas, Fort Worth, that's a massive office market, 32%. They all are. So you got some vulnerability there. And again, the issue here is not just about those building owners. Yes, we think about them, but the bankers who are exposed to those dynamics, particularly in certain regions of the country. What do we talk about? Regional banks. And there's certain regional banks that, of course, that are specialized in commercial real estate lending. Those are the ones most exposed. And that brings me to the final part of the presentation, the forecast. This is Clint Eastwood from the Dirty Harry films. There are 5 of them. First one comes out in 1971. Harry Callahan is the name of the character. Harry Callahan has a partner in that movie named Chico Gonzalez. The role of Chico Gonzalez was played by an actor who later showed up during the Seinfeld episodes playing the part of Poppy, the unhygienic restaurateur. Just a movie in television history in which apparently none of you has any interest. So let me talk again about the leading economic indicators. Small business. So this is the National Federation of Independent Businesses Index of Small Business Optimism. Question, Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? In June, as was the case in May, only 4% said yes, akin to what we saw back in 2008, 2009. They're not confident, and you've seen a lot of large businesses announce layoffs. We're going to depend a lot upon small business to create jobs, but if they're not confident, they're not going to create as many jobs. And in fact, if you look at the so-called hires rate, aforementioned, that in June, we just got data on this earlier this week, fell to 3.4%. We have not seen such slow hiring as a fraction of the overall workforce since roughly 2013, which was not a great year for the U.S. economy, not terrible either, but we're sliding. If you look at more theoretical indicators, like the Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators, this is an index that predicted the 2001 recession, predicted 07, 08, 09, is now telling us something more wicked this way comes. And my thesis, again, is it's these higher interest rates, which have been higher for longer than many people anticipated, now starting to really weigh on the U.S. economy. And the leading index is picking that up. And by the way, it should be noted that, as I mentioned last year, the yield curve is still inverted, which again theoretically suggests a downturn is coming. And history suggests it as well. The yield on the 1-year U.S. Treasury is in green here. The yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury is in blue. As I got up here, the yield on the 1-year U.S. Treasury sitting at 4.8%. The yield on the 10-year, 4.1%. These gray shaded areas are periods of recession dating back several decades. So when do you see that green line, the yield of the interest rate on the 10-year go above the blue line? Just before the 1970 recession, before 73, 74, 75, before 1980, before the 81, 82 episode, before 1999, 1991, before 2001, before 07, 08, 09. Not so much before 2020, that was because of something else, but you got this pretty significant inversion still. So nearly flawless predictive recession for decades. Now, again, the economy right now is performing just fine. Trend growth. Federal Reserve is about to cut interest rates. And you might say, Anirban, why are you being so pessimistic? If the economy can handle higher interest rates, which it has been doing, certainly can handle the lower interest rates to come. Fair enough. The question becomes, can the Federal Reserve reduce rates fast enough to keep this negative momentum in the economy from continuing to build, eventually driving the economy into a downturn sometime later this year or next year? And that brings me to my concluding slide. Go where we're looking and look where we're going is a line from a more recent Clint Eastwood film, 2021's Cry Macho. Was not a blockbuster at the movie theater by any stretch of the imagination, but was a critically acclaimed film. Again, this is a film that Clint Eastwood acts in, but also directs and produces, and also dances in. So he was born on May 31st of 1930. So as this movie opens up, he's 91 years old and he's dancing. He's old enough to be president, just to give you some sense of how old he is. Look, we are a deeply indebted society currently facing high borrowing costs. That's what makes me pessimistic on the near-term outlook. Because I don't think interest rates fall fast enough. A lot of economists out there are pointing the Federal Reserve is now behind the curve. They should have already been reducing rates. Because you can feel some of the air coming out of this economy, particularly in real estate and construction segments, certain real estate and construction segments. Geopolitics, federal elections don't help, additional sources of concern, distraction, and risk. So it will come nearly a year after initially anticipated, but recession is coming in 2024, late 2024, 2025. I actually don't believe 2024, by the way. I just put it up there in case it happens, so I'll then say to people, hey, see, I predicted that. But I think much more likely early stages of next year is when you start to see that downturn. It won't be a very severe one, but enough to jolt the markets, that kind of thing. And with that, hey, thanks a lot for the opportunity. Let's go to Q&A. Thank you very much.
So, as always, wonderful. Ton of questions, so get ready. So, number one, is the variance around average home prices and other metrics hiding how lower income families and percentage of population is being impacted?
Right, so I'll be talking about home prices here, right? Here's what I would say. You can have a recession that affects the lowest 25% of Americans. In fact, I would argue that's already begun. That a lot of Americans, you ask many Americans out there, and you ask them, are we in recession? They'll say, yes, we are. A goodly proportion of them, which of course has implications for the election, so on and so forth. And if you talk to rich people, wealthy people, people with assets, they might also express some concern, but they're likely to talk about the Middle East or South China Seas or Taiwan, whatever it happens to be. But they know the Dow Jones is at 41,000. They know the S&P is about 5,500. They know that as I got up, the NASDAQ was at 400 points for the day. And so you're seeing this real bifurcation in the American population. It's an unwinding of what we saw earlier. Earlier, what we saw was this. Income was growing really among entry-level workers faster than anybody else in percentage terms. We were actually closing the income gap. But now what you see is that wealth gap is simply exploding. And so, yeah, you can have two economies, one for the people with lower incomes who are really struggling with inflation, and one with higher incomes and wealth really benefiting from these higher asset prices.
So, going down that road, is there a shift of construction workforce to other industries like restaurants, businesses? Also, are we losing engineer graduates to readily available, well-paid IT jobs, which require only a 6-month certificate? What can we do about it?
Yes, questions about construction workers, are we losing them to other industries? I don't think there's any doubt that we are. Again, many other industries have really vastly increased their compensation, whether it's the Home Depot retail worker or Lowe's, whomever it happens to be. So you're still sort of in construction. You're using some of the expertise you developed while part of the construction trades, but you're working in a different context. You're working more regular hours. You're not subject to the extremes of weather, so on and so forth, temperatures, rain, whatever it happens to be. You're happy. And you have probably more job security than you might historically have had as a construction worker. And so, yeah, I think we are. We lost a ton of construction workers, you might remember, in years like 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, through the energy patch. So fracking was taking off. Construction was really struggling, particularly residential construction, but all manner of construction. We lost a ton of construction workers back then. A Federal Reserve survey at that time found that about a third of the workers who lost jobs during the Great Recession did not come back to the industry. So, yes, we're seeing a lot of migration. Of course, the number one factor, retirements, because so many of our skilled construction workers are older.
Greg, do we have time for one more? Okay, this is a good one. Any prediction on economic growth based on the results of the current election?
Right. I have some predictions. I'd rather not share them. But so the question is, based on the election's results, you can only take people at their word. Kamala Harris is too new to the race. We haven't even had the Democratic convention yet, but she's the presumptive Democratic nominee. What does one presume? I guess one presumes, not knowing more, that she's going to sort of follow a trajectory set forth by her predecessor, if she's elected, Joe Biden, which means a fair amount of federal spending, lots of subsidization, maintaining the Trump tariffs, and maybe cracking down a little bit more on immigration, as the Biden administration has done very, very recently. Under the Trump administration, what would you get? Well, what has he said? He said he wants to really slow immigration down, shut down that southern border. He wants to raise tariffs on all kinds of goods and services. That, by and large, is inflationary. Economists have been trained that free trade is good, specialization from trade, gains from trade are good. And so, but many Americans like that policymaking, right? Particularly tariffs on Chinese goods. And he's talked also about further corporate tax cuts. So under current law, it is possible that we'll have about $3.4 trillion in tax cuts expire late next year. Not the corporate tax cuts, by the way, those are set in stone. These are tax rates that affect very high income Americans. And what Donald Trump has suggested is he wants to further reduce the corporate tax rate from 21% to maybe 19% and keep some of those tax cuts for very wealthy Americans in place. I'm not saying that's good policy or bad policy, that's for you to decide. But it seems to me that if Trump is true to his word, you get faster growth and also more inflation. What more can I tell you? That's what I would say.
Okay. So have you looked at and factored in the amount of people who borrow against their 401k? Is this a concern for you?
Yeah, it is a concern. I mean, so the question is about people borrowing against their 401k, which is a really bad idea, as you know, for tax reasons and other reasons. But we already have this retirement crisis in America. Too few Americans have really saved enough money for retirement, as everyone knows. In fact, 40% of those who retire depend exclusively on Social Security for their income. Social Security is meant to be an income supplement. It's not meant to be your income. But 40% of Americans didn't save much money. They retire almost exclusively on Social Security funding. And younger generations could have even more difficulties going forward. Because why? Because these high prices have been robbing them of their ability to save for various things, including retirement. And if we know that Social Security, the trust fund, goes insolvent next decade, and so that means that Social Security benefits could be cut, or at least, at a minimum, retirement ages could be raised significantly. You put all that together, yeah, there's reason to be nervous about that. It tells us a lot of Americans are really, on their last legs financially.
Okay. So you're the first time I've seen the clock actually go up a little bit right here. So we actually have a little bit more time.
Yeah. Clock's going up. Yeah.
I'll have to throw in a joke and get rid of this gnat. Okay. So what do you predict will happen if we abolish the Federal Reserve?
Okay, yeah, so that's been a major discussion. The question is, what happens if we abolish the Federal Reserve? I'm not sure. I think it's a very bad idea. But again, I'm very much biased. By what? By all the coursework I did teaching about the benefits offered by the Federal Reserve. Having managed money supply, right? Having a group of policymakers who could respond to various crises. Create money supply when it's needed, take away money supply when it's excessive. For instance, the last few years, money supply has actually been falling in America as Federal Reserve has been trying to reduce inflation. So I'm not a big fan of the current Federal Reserve, by the way. I'm not a big fan of Jerome Powell. A lot of people are. I'm not. He's not an economist. He's an attorney at law. And if I'm ever charged with murder, I'll want an attorney by my side, preferably one who failed legal ethics in graduate school. But when I look at monetary policy making, the great monetary policy makers, it's been people like Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, economists of the highest rank. Ben Bernanke is just a pure genius. So, but the Federal Reserve as an institution I like, and I'm not sure what would happen. I think it'd be catastrophic. Every major society, Australia has the Reserve Bank of Australia, and the Europeans have their European Central Bank, and the Bank of England in England. Every advanced society has these institutions because I think they help.
So last question. Mm-hmm. Are office vacancies at similar levels outside of the U.S. market?
Question is, are office vacancies at similar levels? In some cases, they're higher than ours. I mean, in certain Chinese cities, they're higher than ours. Certain European cities, they're higher than ours because remote work has been a phenomenon everywhere. And so I would say our office vacancy rates are probably higher than most advanced societies, especially cities like San Francisco and some of the other cities I pointed out. But I don't think we're very unusual along that dimension. I think you've got a lot of office building owners around the world who are really struggling. South Korea, other parts of the world.
Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, give it up. Well done. Well done.